Hello and welcome to Past Your Bedtime. My name's Bev. It's not uncommon to shift your views on things over time. We all hopefully mature and form opinions throughout our lives, having gained some life experience, or having put the time in to understand different perspectives before pinning our colours to the mast. Farming is almost unique in its ability to polarise views from within the industry as much as from outside it. Fewer jobs stir up such an emotional response as to the rights and wrongs of how it's carried out. Things like animal welfare, carbon emissions, subsidies, badger culling, deforestation, reforestation, fertilisers, no-till, even the one activity probably most recognised as symbolising agriculture, ploughing, is a cause for debate and derision in some quarters. Finding a way through the noise and opinion pieces, given the wealth of commentary available, mine included, I suppose, can feel like a full-time job. I suspect that less than 1% of actual farmers engage with any of the thought leadership that's written online about such topics, preferring to flick through the pages of the industry magazines on the farmhouse table after having checked the all-important livestock and grain price tables at the back. But with a new generation of farmers more in tune with social media and online resources, the next iteration of farming is already changing gear. A readiness to embrace new systems of farming, or in some cases a reversion to old practices, is now being consumed by an ever-curious cohort looking to create their version of the farm. My guest today is Joe Stanley, columnist, author, and head of sustainable farming at the Allerton Project. Joe freely admits that his views have changed over time, from an entrenched, almost arrogant view of what it meant to be a farmer. His curiosity drove him to explore different systems of farming, an interest that would ultimately see him become a recognised voice and an advocate for sustainability in farming. Recorded in early April, I asked him what he'd been up to lately.
What are we doing this week? We've had a surprising lack of, I suppose it's because it's the school holidays, so a lack of kind of actual stuff happening at the Allerton Project in terms of visitors and all that sort of thing. But I was there yesterday just having a look round, and it's good to see, the crops are looking relatively well compared to recent years. And there's all sort of new science bits and pieces of equipment deposited in various fields. So yeah, things are progressing, but we could actually do with a bit of water now, to be honest, which is remarkable to relate. But then think back 12 months, and this was the start of an historic drought. So we just hope we don't get another one of those this year.
Yeah. Probably for the purposes of the podcast, which we should get onto, I should really love to understand how you got into farming. I think I heard you on a previous podcast refer to the fact that you never really wanted to be a farmer. You grew up on a farm, but it didn't float your boat. And whether or not that was always the way you felt, or whether that was down to your first day.
Sure. Would this be with Rich Stockdale, the oxygen conservation one? Yeah, no, I mean, no, that's true. I mean, I grew up on a family farm. We were sort of third generation. I was the third generation on my family farm, which was in northwest Leicestershire. And growing up on a farm is a wonderful experience. Of course, it's a very privileged experience to be able to grow up on a farm in the great outdoors and all the rest of it. And I of course, that was kind of it in my head. That was what I was then going to do, all through my childhood until, as you might have heard, until kind of my first proper harvest on the farm, thrown in at the deep end. And that, for whatever reason, it just really put me off. And it was years before I then ended up farming again. I went and did a non-agricultural degree, and I'd worked several jobs completely outside of agriculture after I left university. And then kind of circumstance eventually brought me back to the family farm. And I was there for sort of about 12 years, farming and, dairy farming, arable farming, beef farming. And then, about 5 years ago, I ended up at the Allerton Project, which is in sort of the very easternmost reaches of Leicestershire, before you get to sort of the Badlands of the east of England. And so I've been there for about the last 5 years now. And it's really interesting work, of course. Very different experience. You go from being a family farmer on a very conventional that very conventional family farming type system in many cases, to a place where really, there are lots of questions being asked and lots of very different things being done. So it's been a, to be fair, it's quite a challenging, transition, but, huge amount to learn, of course.
What did you think you wanted? And I'm sure at the age of 17, 18, I didn't know what I wanted to do. You just go for what's available at the time or what you think floats your boat. So where did you think you were headed if you weren't going to,
No idea.
Bought into it?
No idea. And this is, I think it's a huge problem, isn't it? When you actually look back and you think you're asking very young people to, what A levels do you want to do? What university do you want to go to? What course do you want to do at that university? You're really asking people to kind of set themselves on a path, aren't you? Very, very early in life. When in my case, I mean, I was relatively studious, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And even in my case, I was choosing the subjects and the courses that I thought would be easiest for me, not that would give me any sort of employability later in life. And I've always been very envious of people who actually, my wife, for example, from a very young age, for whatever reason, she decided she wanted to be a dentist. So she worked towards that throughout her, whole sort of school life into university. And I'm just very envious of anyone who knows what they want to do, because of course, most people can achieve whatever it is they want to do in life if they can work towards it and lay the foundations. But certainly my situation was that, you kind of, you finish university and all of a sudden you realize you're not really qualified to do anything and you don't still know what it is you want to do. And I think that's a great shame. And, young people should certainly be given much more support. And, with my kids, for example, my plan is to really, from a young age, to really try to make them think about what they'd like to do and then to try to help to guide them in that direction and not to just leave it to chance and to their own, proclivities and just let them drift through life. Because I think, who knows what we all could have been, right? If we'd have, we all realize later in life what makes us, what's passionate, what drives us, right?
Yeah.
Yourself, Beverly, imagine if you could go back however much time and sort of tell yourself, in future, this is what you're going to want to do. Work towards it from this point. But yeah.
I was interviewed on a podcast back in my old career, which was call centres, customer service, support industry. And the host asked me what I would have wanted to tell my younger self if I knew then what I know now. And my answer was, off the top of my head, I guess I should have married a farmer, because I like the outdoor life, I like nature, I get up early in the morning. It just seemed to be that would have felt like an easier route or a more satisfying route. But hey ho.
That you didn't have to go through the marriage route. You could have gotten into it on your own of your own volition.
That is really that's actually something that wasn't obvious to me when I embarked on this, that there were so many women in farming. And I'm not a fan of anything that's got women in the title, women in networking, women in customer service, and now women in farming. But so I would go completely the opposite direction of anything that touts those credentials. However, having met some phenomenal characters in agriculture over the last 12 months, the women in agriculture particularly are unlike any others that I've met in my career, from the point of view of truly being supportive of each other and sharing experiences and knowledge. And I don't think they hold themselves out there as being anything special or different or in a category, if you like. But yeah, there's some really inspiring stories and some really smart women and men out there in ag.
Well, absolutely. I mean, as you know, the recently sort of, been out of the role for a couple of years now, but probably the most effective president that the National Farmers Union's ever had was Minette Batters, and she's now in the House of Lords and doing great things there. And she's just the most prominent of a huge array of, incredibly capable women who, I think you're right. Look, I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about this, but for so many years, for decades, have kind of toiled away in the background in many cases and been the backbone of many farming operations. And it seems at least, only in relatively recent years that you're starting to see some visibility of that whole massive sector of the agricultural industry, which, that had previously seemed to just continue plugging away in obscurity. And it's great now that is changing very rapidly, or at least it certainly seems to be. And that's a fantastic development.
I think you're right. She's Minette. She's got a book coming out soon. I saw something this morning about an event for the book launch, so I think I'll get that. You wrote a book, didn't you?
Yeah, Minette did the foreword for it.
Ah, fantastic! I haven't read it yet, and guilty as charged. I'll look that one up.
Right, you're in a large club in that circumstance.
I'm not a very fast reader, so I listen to a few audiobooks, but I don't seem to be able to find the headspace for doing that at the moment. I think maybe because I'm talking all day and on a computer of sorts at most points. Now, tell me what the book was about, because I think where you moved on to after writing the book was a slightly different direction. Am I right?
Yeah, so the book I wrote in sort of the first half of 2021, and it was about, the intention of the book was to describe the basics of modern agriculture to the non-farming reader in an accessible way. So, there's no shortage of books out there kind of about the countryside and nature, many of them, frankly, kind of deeply critical of modern farming practices. And of course, there are things to be critical of in modern farming practices, but never with the context of, and what I wanted to get across was, why do we farm the way we farm today? And, to what extent, essentially, is that driven by external factors to what the farmer can control? And look, there's also lots of sort of really nicely written books about, upland sheep farming and the fells and all this sort of thing, and things sort of based around family and tradition. But again, what I wanted to write was a book more about the reality of the vast majority of our farming in this country, which is lowland, mixed, arable, beef and sheep and all that sort of thing. And sort of really trying to get that across. Why do farmers use fertilizers? Why do we use pesticides? What does it mean to sit on a tractor for 12 to 15 hours a day? So it was really, that was the intention, because I think it's just really important that we get that across to people who have no connection with agriculture. Because look, the reality is, farmers are about 1% of the workforce. And, again, the reality is that over recent decades, the emphasis, the importance attached to farming and food production in this country has declined massively. We really are in a situation now, really, where it feels like government has almost no interest in what is done in the countryside, and around food production, around the importance of being able to produce our food in the countryside. And of course, through doing that, what we can do to sort of make nature thrive. So, really important, I think, to try to reach out to our consumers, voters, and to try and get them interested. And of course, it's only going to be through consumers and through voters that really any significant change is going to happen. Because organizations like the National Farmers Union, they can get into rooms with government, and they can talk, and they can sometimes have significant victories. But the reality is, the overall trend over the last 30 years has been a declining influence of the agricultural sector and a declining interest in government and what farming can provide. And that really does have to change.
What, so you published it in 2021?
21, yeah. It came out in summer of 2021 in hardback, and then about 2 years later in paperback. And yeah, no, as a thing, I'm really proud of, having a book was number one on my bucket list. I love to read. I've always loved reading. I've always loved writing and books. So to write a book, incredibly proud to have done that. And it's not become an international bestseller, but it has done well in its own right. And I've just been so proud of the positive response it's had. If you look on Amazon and see the reviews, it's got 4.8 stars and almost universally really positive reviews from people who basically are saying, really readable and really interesting to learn about the realities of farming today. And that's what I was trying to achieve. So yeah, no, really, really proud of how it all turned out.
Yeah. Have you spotted or thought through any changes that have happened in the last 5 years since you put that together? Will you do an update, or are there some things that you think, actually, I now need to reframe that because the conversation's moved on?
Well, it's interesting. So there was obviously a section, and if anyone's interested in having a look, the book's called Farm to Fork: The Challenge of Sustainable Farming in 21st Century Britain.
Right.
The reality is, actually, although my own thinking has changed quite significantly in terms of, again, look, what I was trying to do was to demonstrate the reality of the average farm, which I did. And so that still stands. But my own knowledge of things like regenerative agriculture and more sustainable ways of farming has increased massively in the last 5 years through my work at the Allerton Project. But to be fair, it really still stands. I mean, for example, there was a whole section at the end around talking about government policy post-Brexit and what that would mean. And the scary thing is that in the last 5 years, in some ways, we've gone backwards rather than forwards. You know, the core issues I was talking about, lack of budget, lack of direction, oscillating government policy, lack of interest from governments around our food supply, the challenge of trying to feed into a retail sector which is only interested in the lowest possible price. None of that has changed. And actually, 5 years on, an English government policy, in some ways you could say, has gone backwards. We're currently farmers in the UK, farmers in England, because agriculture is a devolved issue.
Yeah.
Farmers in England have been unable to access any government support for nature-friendly farming since last March, and are going to be unable to access any until much later in this year, in 2026. We're actually further away than we were 5 years ago from a sustainable agricultural sector. And then you look at things like commodity prices, the number of shocks that have come through in the last few years, which have had a huge impact on food and farming, from Iran, Ukraine, etc. COVID, of course, was just before the book came out. But no, frankly, I would take what I wrote 5 years ago and I would just say, look, it hasn't improved. We haven't gone anywhere. Politicians seem to be less interested in a sustainable food and farming sector today than they were 5 years ago. And yet all of the old European support that we still had 5 years ago has now gone. So, it's really an incredibly testing time for the agricultural sector in a way, frankly, I don't think we've seen since the 1930s.
Yeah. So you mentioned sustainable farming. That's the subheading of the book. Give me a feel for when your attention sort of focused on that area of sustainability or regen, or the broader umbrella term of natural capital. When did that start to play on your mind or guide your thinking in terms of what you were going to be doing in farming?
I left my family farm in 2021 and went to the Allerton Project, but my kind of thoughts had started to shift towards that in sort of 2019, 2020. I'd started to think, actually, is this the best way that we can be farming? Just because it's always been this way, is that the best way? Is what we're doing sustainably? I'd start to notice things like soil running off fields or building up against dry stone walls at the bottoms of cultivated slopes, and you would start to think, actually, that can't be sustainable long term. So my thoughts kind of started to shift that way, and of course that's because in that time we were starting to see a lot more talk about this in the farming press, especially. But then really sort of accelerated once I went to the Allerton Project and started to be able to put some of those kind of fragmentary thoughts I'd been having together with, the data and the evidence that we were generating at the Allerton Project. So, I think I consider myself lucky enough that although I grew up and was then farming in a very conventional way, I kind of had the personal, curiosity to then start to put various little bits and pieces together, and then start to think, actually, no, we can, and we must do things better than how we've been doing them up to this point. And I really strongly believe that today.
How did you get involved with the Allerton Project? Actually, probably you should explain what the Allerton Project is about, but how you came to be involved in it.
So the Allerton Project is a research and demonstration farm just on the border of Leicestershire and Rutland. It's about about 5 miles to the west of Uppingham. We have one field in Rutland and the other fields are all in Leicestershire. And we've been there since 1992. And essentially what we do is, it's a working commercial farm. We've got arable, we've got livestock on the farm. But we also have a full-time team of research scientists working on the farm. It's about 320 hectares, so sort of a reasonable size. And our work over the last 35 years has been to basically demonstrate how you can have food production alongside a thriving natural environment. So a lot of the things that farmers do today on farms across the UK is based on research that we initially carry out at the Allerton Project. So, for example, things like winter birdseed mixes and supplementary feeding, beetle banks to bring more beneficial invertebrates into farming systems. So we've done an awful lot of that research over the years. We have about 2,000 visitors a year. So they come to see, on the ground what the research is that we've been doing and are doing. So yeah, it's a really quite unique place in as much as there is a working proper farm around which we do all of this research. And yeah, it's a great place to be involved with. And I ended up there. Ultimately, circumstances changed on the family farm, and that coincided with this role. Sort of my role is head of sustainable farming. Basically, I deal with the majority of the people that come to see us every year and sort of talk about our work. So that's kind of my job, is issue like knowledge exchange to our visitors every year. So yeah, the role sort of became available. It was just really good timing, and I was lucky to get that job.
Is that full time now for you?
It is, yeah, it is. I've done other things over recent years as well. You know, I've recently stepped down after 4 years as county chairman for the National Farmers Union. I also did other roles with the NFU, such as sort of sitting on their environment forum, so trying to bring more environmental focus into the NFU's policies, which of course is, you know, food production and the environment really are absolutely welded at the hip these days. So that was really good. And yeah, other sort of roles within industry. So yeah, no, it's interesting. And again, look, going forward, where farming is at the minute, commodity prices are at historic lows, costs are at historic highs. Yeah, we have to work out how we can bring more of that natural capital and those ecosystem services that are then properly recompensed by society into farming. And I think that's going to be a really important element of what we need to do, yeah, for the rest of this decade.
So you get invited to speak at things, you get invited onto podcasts, you're asked to comment on the political environment. It's quite taxing if you're the type of individual that's constantly got thoughts going on about how you feel about situations. What do you do to unwind?
Oh, wow. You know what? I've recently started, so I've stepped down from my kind of industry roles. At the minute, the only thing I'm doing is kind of working at the Allerton Project, because I've got a young family and there was just too much going on. But I've started volunteering at our local beavers trip. My son does beavers, and it's actually really nice to go and do a thing that's got absolutely nothing to do with agriculture, which is, you know, I literally just turn up. I'm a warm body in the room to basically make up the legally required numbers. But it's just nice. It's nice to go and do that and kind of not be a farmer and not have anything to do with agriculture. It's a strangely nice way to unwind, to just do something completely unrelated to the day job.
Yeah, well, there's no expectation.
There's absolutely no expectation of me now. I'm literally just there.
I read Will Evans' article just recently. I think he was making the point about, I only saw half of the article, but making the point about being quite an introvert, but being thrust into a situation where I think he took his youngest daughter to a rugby event in Paris. And so in order to shake it off and get it out of his system when he came back to the farm, so, no, I just need a couple of days fixing fences just on my own.
Yeah.
And I meet quite a few people, and I probably consider myself the same way, that when I'm working, when I'm full on, when I'm thinking about what it is that I need to be doing, I'm 110% on that. But I absolutely have to balance that with some no talking time, leave me alone, isolation. I crave both of them. Do you know what I mean?
I completely agree with what Will said. When I was still farming, you know, physically farming myself, I've not done any actual farming for a good few years now, but sitting on a digger and digging out ditches through the winter, farm ditches, yeah, you can literally, incredibly satisfying, and you can just turn your brain off and do it. And that was always a good way to decompress.
Yeah. How have your views changed about sustainability over the years? If at all, as you said, you spotted things were changing, you observed changes in the landscape, but your opinion of the importance of soil, etc., did that shift over a period of time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I you know, if I went back 10 years, I would have very, very different views to those I have now. Yeah, you even look at my early kind of writings and things like Farmers Weekly. I've been writing Farmers Weekly now for nearly 10 years, and I do keep offering to stop, but they don't accept. So that's nice. But yes, I was very reflexively, any criticism of agriculture, I would very, well, no, For the first 6 or 7 years of my kind of proper farming career, when I went back to the family farm, I had no interest in anything that happened beyond the farm gate. And I had no interest in really anything to do with sustainability or the environment on the farm. It just wasn't at all on my radar. I literally kind of worked, went home and slept, worked, went home and slept. And it was only around 2016 I started to actually take a wider interest in what was going on in the industry. And at that point, sort of, starting to then engage with things like social media and that sort of thing. Any criticism of agriculture, I was just reflexively dismissive of, and I would say that people just didn't know what they were talking about. And of course, it turned out I didn't know what I was talking about, and I was just being very reflexively, angered by any criticism of things like, I remember when Michael Gove started talking about ploughing being a bad thing and we should do less ploughing, and I was just absolutely outraged by this. But in reality, what was I outraged by? It's because I did a lot of ploughing, and therefore I was annoyed that someone would suggest it was a bad thing. I had absolutely no evidential basis for saying that there was no problem at all with ploughing, for example. So no, my views have changed hugely, and you still see a lot of that. I wrote a piece once for Farmers Weekly talking about farmer exceptionalism. And that's what I was experiencing, 10 years ago, where I just basically thought that the normal rules and things like evidence didn't apply to farmers, that we were doing an important job. We should just be left to it. People didn't understand the reality of what they were talking about. And, basically there was no room for criticizing agriculture because British farming is the best. And yeah, my views have changed hugely on that over the years. And although I still think that on a whole, British agriculture still does have incredibly high standards compared to the global average, there's huge numbers of areas that we can improve and must improve. But of course, the corollary to that is that the money needs to be there to help us to do that. And that's the big sticking point at the minute. Yeah, there's no support coming whatsoever from central government to at least 50% of English farms today. And the supply chain continues to turn the screws on what they're willing to pay to farmers. So how do we improve? There's very, very many things we can do, but most of them require assistance. And that assistance is declining, not increasing. So how do we square that circle?
Yeah. Do you think there's been an arrogance, therefore, in the farming community over the years? And is that shifting now?
There is an arrogance. There is, look, that it's a very sweeping statement to say that, but there are certainly very high profile characters within the farming community, not high profile. Well, no, even there are some farmers I can think of who have very high profiles, even within the wider sort of within wider society who people will recognize who they are. Yeah, I think that is a very good description, that there is this arrogance that would echo what I was talking about of myself 10 years ago. I think there are, but that is a huge generalization. There are a huge number of farmers who are, incredibly humble, incredibly aware of the limitations of the industry, of the things that we do need to improve on. But the problem is, I recently came off X. I've been on X for 8 or 9 years now, and I've found it an incredibly useful tool over the years for learning things, for communicating, for making connections with people. But I came off it a month or so ago now, finally, because it just got to the point where the majority of the farmers making noise on it do reflect that arrogance, that just, that reflexive, impulsive, just leave us alone to do what we want. You don't know what you're talking about, and are hostile to any sort of questioning. And it has just become, for me, it's become just a really unhappy, toxic kind of place. And of course, that's just social media. That's not real. But there is this problem that we do have certain prominent people within the industry who, with a real lack of understanding of how, frankly, the real world works, how science works, etc., and really, frankly, a lack of self-analysis and how things they can be saying can come across to the average person in the street, if you like. It can be highly damaging to the wider vision of British agriculture. Now, luckily, you then have fantastic standard bearers for the industry. People like Will Evans, right? People like Minette Batters, Tom Bradshaw, the current president of the NFU, who are fantastic representatives of the industry. But with the rise of social media, especially, of course, it's increasingly possible for individuals to, have a very
Anyone
loud
with
voice.
a view. Yeah.
Anyone with a view. And of course, that's not just restricted to agriculture, but of course, I do see that frequently. So yeah, it's an issue.
The pace of change is just increasing, and anyone with a view can put it out there. I'm extremely conscious of not putting forward any view one side of the political house or anything that isn't backed up by my own research. And I've only been looking at this for the last 12 months, so it would be completely wrong of me to put forward anything unless I'd researched it fully. So in bringing guests onto this podcast, what started out as a tell me why you're in farming, what inspires you to stay in farming, what do you do all day, what does this term mean, learning the vernacular, I didn't ever want it to jump on the bandwagon of the themes. But I can't have these conversations without being aware of that backdrop. And it feels as though that has changed in the last couple of years. I'm finding it hard to separate whether I just feel it's an uptick in the conversation amongst the non-farming population, or whether it's because I've come from there and now I am exposed to this new subject and I'm feeding off of it.
So politics has definitely become a bigger thing within farming. Polarization has become a bigger thing within farming in recent years. So we've seen, obviously, the whole development of this movement where there's very genuine political discourse that needs to be had around food farming and the environment. But there's a huge level of disillusionment that's come into the farming community, the wider rural community, around the way that central government treats the industry. So obviously, traditionally, it's no secret that the majority of farmers have always voted Conservative. They've always been, they've always been quite socially conservative, quite economically conservative as well. But then at the last election, a lot of farmers were open to giving the Labour Party a try because things had been so dire under the Conservatives for so long. Now, of course, Labour immediately, and look, I'm speaking personally here, but I think you'd struggle to find many farmers who wouldn't say that Labour immediately essentially betrayed the promises it had made to the farming community before the last election. And they'd made a lot of promises. They'd put in a lot of legwork to court the farming community. So why they decided so quickly to turn their back on them, I'm really not sure. And it's been highly damaging to them, of course, as well, and spending their political capital. So now you've got Reform coming in as a strong contender for a lot of farming votes, but not just Reform, of course, but also, what I would describe as potentially quite shadowy pseudo-political organizations who turn up on the streets and are identifying themselves with the farming community, even though they have nothing to do with the farming community. And farming seems to be getting dragged into this culture wars issue.
Yeah.
And it's becoming one of the participants in the culture wars, which is I don't think that benefits anybody. And it historically, look, there's no shortage of examples of agriculture and farmers being dragged into those sorts of issues and used often as a Trojan horse for those outside issues to be brought into the public discourse. But that is a new development. That's not been something really that's been associated with agriculture in my lifetime. And it's I don't think that's a positive development. And I think too many farmers have become so deeply disillusioned with mainstream political discourse that they're willing to kind of allow that to happen to them, and they're willing to give perhaps less savory political opinions a chance. It's understandable because of the level of betrayal they feel from both mainstream political parties. But it's still, I think, a highly unfavorable circumstance for us to find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, back to the positives. Who are your farming heroes, if you have any?
Oh, wow. I'll tell you what, so my granddad he started his farming career in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And he was alive until I was about, probably late teens. But again, sadly, I just had no interest in farming back then. And I never questioned him on his career. I saw him, I saw him quite regularly, but we never discussed it. And I had no concept of really history at that point, or the hinterland of agriculture. And he died, and that was about sort of 20 years ago now. But it turns out he'd written a memoir, and I recently found this, or was handed this memoir by a family member who I'd lost contact with. I read it, and it was only sort of 65 pages of typewritten notes, but he had a fantastic, farming from the depression, the agricultural depression of the 30s, setting up shop on where, my family farm still is today. But he was kind of a gentleman farmer, as it turns out. He was a big player in the agricultural industry in the post-war period. He rose to prominence. He was personally involved in a lot of the big decisions made in government in that kind of 1950s, 60s, 70s period. He was very prominent in the media. He was awarded an OBE for services to agriculture. Knew a lot of the sort of big political players, ministers of the time. And looking back at that, I mean, he achieved a huge amount. And I one of my big regrets is that I didn't know this when he was alive, or wasn't interested when he was alive, and I didn't talk to him about this. He certainly never volunteered the information. I think he was too humble to do so. But he had an absolute, and the thing about his career is it spanned that whole, we kind of all know, the farmers all know of that, the broad spread of agricultural history from the depression of the 30s, when agriculture was completely unvalued, all the way through then that post-war period when farmers became the most important people in the economy, to when it started to fall off a cliff again. His memoirs end, I think, in the 1990s, and the last page, he is regretting the direction of travel, even in the late 1990s, that the industry has taken. His career spanned this wonderful boom period, and then it was starting to enter the doldrums again. And he was regretting. He thought this was just an absolute tragedy. What he would have thought to think the state of things today, I don't know. But no, I think I would have loved to have talked to him about his experiences in retrospect. So I think, he would be my kind of farming hero. And again, what a shame that that's only something I could say really in the last 6 months since having picked up this memoir.
What a fantastic thing to discover, though. And clearly, you've inherited that curiosity or desire to communicate about the state of farming. Yeah. Sounds like an idea for a book, really. You could, off the back of that, build out on your grandfather's history and in those times.
I'm certainly getting a number of articles out of the ideas that have come from it.
My family farmed insofar as they were agricultural labourers. My great-great-grandfather was a pig farmer, and I did find in a book about the Henley Park estate. I'm from Surrey, and the family didn't really, well, my father's side came from that area, didn't move out of that area at all much. But I found a photograph of a farm worker on the Henley Park estate, and it's Mr. Mullard with his plough and his 2 Suffolk punches. And so I like to look back at that and think that somewhere in my DNA there's this need to get my fingers in the soil. It comes from them. Interesting to see. And so, given what I've been looking at, here's a question that I asked at the PX Farms Open Day, which I attended last year, and they had panel discussion. What would the panel, or in this case, what would Joe Stanley say to somebody looking to get into agriculture? Now, for me, I'm post-career transition, and generally this conversation tends to focus on what we need to do to encourage youngsters to get into farming. But if for anyone looking at agriculture as a career change, what would your advice be?
Well, there's no shortage of opportunities within the industry. I mean, I guess the big challenge is, are you someone who wants to basically be a farmer in their own right? Do you want to somehow come into your own farm? Now that's a challenge. Unless you're independently wealthy and you can go and buy a farm up and do all that sort of thing, well, that is a challenge. Now there's a decreasing opportunity for young people, especially, to set themselves up in starter farms, etc. these days. However, in really across the spectrum in terms of other roles within the industry, there's a huge amount of opportunity. We are desperately short of skilled and really, frankly, the most important thing is motivated people within just farming. If we're just looking at working the land, etc., we are so short of people who are wanting to do that, especially in the livestock sector. So anyone who wants to get into that, there's huge opportunity there to go and work within the sector. And frankly, look, you look at people like farm managers, right, on large estates. Actually, those guys have, they command big salaries. They have the ability to progress through the industry and to actually make a really good career and of things. Now, it's a tough job, but actually there's all the, you don't have to associate agriculture even with low salaries. Even people, skilled sprayer operators on arable or horticultural farms can be picking up really big salaries these days, because again, those guys are in short supply. We don't have to think of agriculture as either a low wage or a closed off industry. And there are ways to get into, of course. There's still agricultural colleges that people can go through, even later in life, to do postgraduate courses. There's no shortage of places who are offering practical, vocational training and the sorts of qualifications that you need to be able to just, sit on a tractor sprayer, for example. So there's lots of opportunity there, and especially to get into the livestock sector, because the livestock sector is particularly short of people who are willing to, let's be honest, it's tough work. It is hard work. But if you've got the motivation to want to do it, there really are, we're crying out for the people to do that. And then you've got the wider the wider agricultural sector and all sorts of new roles that are coming up within that sector that weren't even there 10 years ago, in things like drones and AI and all sorts of things. Veterinary, we're incredibly short of vets who want to do large animal work in this country. So there are opportunities, and look, it's the biggest, most important job on earth, agriculture, and it increasingly, of course, especially here in the UK, is becoming entwined with those natural capital services, ecosystem services, and things like tree planting, maintenance, forestry, all those sorts of things. We're desperately short of people to lay and coppice hedgerows and to build dry stone walls. All of these kind of traditional skills that have died out over the last century or so. So look, I think really, if you've got a good work ethic and you're passionate about getting stuck in, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there for people to get involved.
Yeah. I saw you did an experimental hedge laying experiment the other day, didn't you? What was behind?
Yeah.
What was behind the thinking? Because I interviewed a hedge layer, the Devon hedge layer, a few months back, and completely geeked out about bill hooks for a morning. What was the thinking behind that experiment? What was that looking to achieve?
Well, we're lucky to have a guy working at Allerton Project called Joe, who, he's a very skilled hedge layer himself, comes from a farming background, and he now works as our conservation officer. So we're lucky to have someone who can do all that work in-house. And what he's trying to do across the estate is to create this kind of patchwork of different hedgerow management techniques, and not just coppicing here, laying here, planting here, and flailing here, but also, within the same stretch of hedge, how can we look? The main thing with laying hedges is it's incredibly labor intensive. You can do maybe 10 meters a day when you're putting the stake and binders in, and there's a lot of work involved there. Whereas if you can, I think what he calls his conservation laying technique, which involves basically taking a lot less of the brash out, just cutting through the stems of the plants, leaning them over, you can do 100 meters a day. Now, what we're monitoring at the Allerton Project is that longer, medium term, is that going to give a better outcome for nature? Are we going to see, because it's a less drastic intervention, actually, is that better for biodiversity in the short term? Is it better for carbon? Well, what you're referring to there, Beverly, is where he's taken a quite a thin, straggly hedge on top of the hill, which is quite exposed to wind, and he's laid it in this conservation manner. Now, without the stakes and binders, there's the danger of it basically keep being blown out of position by the prevailing winds. So he's tied it down with wool rope, which is just down with some tent pegs. And his intention is either to remove the rope once the hedge starts to bind itself together and regrow, or to just leave it in the hedge and it can decompose naturally. And it's just essentially a quick, cheap way of laying a hedge, so you can get more done, better value for money, and all that sort of thing. And we'll see whether it has a beneficial impact for nature as well.
So you must have a mixture then of experiments and projects, of a mixture of time to see the result. So for that example, it's probably going to be 5 years before he can tell the difference, maybe.
Well, no, actually, I mean, because what we're looking at, if you're looking at a conventionally laid hedge, which of course, initially it's very thin, it's very narrow. There's not a lot of biomass there. We should be able to see in the first season, are we seeing more farmland birds? visiting the conservation laid hedge, which is thicker, bushier,
Right.
gives more cover. So we will see, hopefully, in very short order, if in the short term you're having because of course laying a hedge has a short-term negative impact on the biodiversity within that hedge. Of course it does. Longer term,
Yeah.
beneficial impact. But can we kind of find a happy halfway house? And then, yes, you're right, Beverly. Long term, what is the impact of that? Of that crudely laid hedge in the long term? And
did it survive 5 hard winters and storms, etc.?
Or will it need relaying in 10 years as opposed to 40 from, or 20 from a conventionally laid hedge? We'll see. So yeah, short term versus long term monitoring. We'll see what the difference is over time.
I can see why your job's satisfying, right? Because you're constantly working on things that sort of have a start, a middle, and an end. Really, the nature of experimenting is that you have to reach a conclusion to form an opinion.
Ideally, but of course, farmers in general are, look, many of the things that farmers do are for the incredibly long term, planting a hedge or a tree plantation. You're talking about things that might not give you benefits for 5, 10, 20 years. Talking about some of this nature recovery stuff that farmers are now getting involved with, where those contracts are supposed to be 20 years. Talk about biodiversity net gain or nutrient neutrality agreements. 125 years farmers are being asked to commit. So we're talking about very long-term timescale. So yeah, a lot of what farmers in general are doing we are working on 3, 5, 10-year timescales. And that can be incredibly satisfying. Farmers will say, oh, I've only got, 20 harvests left in me. I've got 20 more times to get this right, or to get my bed, it's that sort of level of timescale requires the same level of commitment, really, from people like policymakers to help farmers to do these things for the long term, especially when we're talking about nature and the nature benefits that farmers can derive. So yeah, I think it's that kind of disconnect between short-term political cycles and the longer-term cycles in which farmers operate, and we need to bring those two together.
Yeah, difficult to see how that can be achieved, as you say, with the political cycles. And then within an administration, the changes that have happened, particularly DEFRA's change of who's in charge several times. Interesting. Well, I'm conscious of the time creeping on, but I am also interested to know what you feel the next 5 years is going to look at. Impossible question, I know, but what would you like to see happen in the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, we know climate change will continue to essentially become more challenging. So we have to address that. We have to expect that, in my farming career, you could expect the weather to do more or less what you wanted it to do at more or less the time of year you wanted it to do it. And that really lasted up until 2018, when we started to see these seasonal extremes, monthly extremes, which have really thrown everything on its head. And we can't expect to go back to that pre-2018 period. So I think we have to expect that, in terms of more challenge, we're going to see that. We're going to see more global disruption. We're going to see more instability. We're going to need to build more resilience into the farming sector. And we're going to see more of these, what Professor Tim Benton calls these black swan events. These unexpected things happening all over the world, which throw, in our case, agriculture into disarray. So we're going to see essentially more unpredictability from both the weather and from global geopolitics in the next 5 years. It's just going to happen. So what I would like to see is recognition of that fact and support for that fact. Now, interestingly, this morning, the Prime Minister did a piece in the Guardian newspaper saying, recognizing this and recognizing that there has to be a step change in how the UK operates. He talked about energy security. He talked about kinetic defense. He even brought in reforming the welfare system in order to build greater resilience. He did not mention food or farming or the environment. So we're still in this crazy place where, despite everything that farming can deliver for society, food production, food security, environmental, ecosystem service benefits upon which society absolutely depends, we're still not talking about that. Now, that's really worrying, because there is a huge amount of positivity within the agricultural sector. There's so much that farming can deliver in the next 5 years to a more resilient society, not least greater employment. And yet we're absolutely nowhere with this, really, frankly, either from the political side or, frankly, when we're talking about the food supply chain, especially the retailers who are really still absolutely focused on lowest cost. So look, the next 5 years, think where we were 5 years ago and everything that's happened in that time. But in agricultural terms, it's actually a pretty short period of time. It's one crop rotation for many farms. It's a couple of generations of breeding animals. We need to get on this, and there is huge potential within the agricultural sector to deliver for not only for those kind of resilience factors, but also for economic growth, for employment, and for rural communities. But we need that backing, and ultimately that's going to come from things such as this, Beverly, from this podcast that maybe a few people will listen to, who can then go away and they can talk to their local MP. They can write a letter to a national magazine and sort of express that they'd like to see more support for sustainable food production in the UK. So this is all part of that process where we just need to get more people on board who can then start to have conversations, can start to put pressure on our political and economic systems to hopefully flag that this is an important thing that we do need to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I hope that is the case. I'd love to think that somebody listening to this might do something about it with the information, and that I should myself be a little bit more active, if you like. Rishi Sunak is my MP, for example.
Well, he might come back at the next, maybe he'll be PM again. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Well, listen, it's lovely to talk to you, and I know you're incredibly busy. Hopefully see you at some of this year's events.
I'm always knocking about.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on to the podcast, and wish you a happy springtime.
No, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
I'm very grateful to Joe for sparing the time to talk with me today. Check out the work of the Allerton Project if you can. I'll pop the link to their website in the show notes. Or if you're like me and need yet another book about farming on your bedside table, why not search out Farm to Fork, The Challenge of Sustainable Farming in 21st Century Britain. I'm sure it'll be a good read. An online review of the book from Farmers Weekly suggests it's a must-read for any agricultural student, and so I'm including me in that. Learning is, as they say, a lifelong journey, and coming up in a few weeks' time, I'm going to be talking to some people in the agricultural sector who've embarked upon their own journey of self-discovery. More about that soon. That's all for today. If it is past your bedtime, well, perhaps it's time to turn in. Until next time.